Slow and steady wins the race, according to Toyota, which is why they've been working tirelessly to refine their hybrid systems, and now we've got one of the very latest iterations in this, the new Corolla Cross Hybrid. Now, the Corolla Cross has been facelifted for 2025, which is why up front we now get this much more restrained, much more pared back look compared to the previous generation, which is why, for example, we no longer get the massive downward turn grille. Instead, you have this hexagonal pattern, which is done up in body color, which bleeds in seamlessly into the bumpers, which I think makes for a much cleaner, much more modern look. The headlights have also been reprofiled for this car. They now come with scrolling LED indicators up here, with the LED time running light sitting underneath. Now, this panel here is supposed to link the two headlights together to make it look like a single piece. Doesn't quite work that well, but all right. Now, because this is a Corolla Cross, we of course still have the required contrasting body cladding on the bumper, which also bleeds down to the sides and obviously goes toward the rear in order to emphasize the fact this is a cross. Now, one of the ways to tell that this is the hybrid over the non-hybrid model, among things like the grille and of course this panel here, is of course the badge, because only hybrid Toyota models get this blue halo around the Toyota logo, whereas the non-hybrid models just get it on black, which I think is interesting detail. Now, another detail that I thought was interesting until I looked a little bit closer were actually these panels here, because for a minute there I thought that they had improved the aerodynamics of this car in order to improve the overall efficiency. However, these do nothing. It's just for aesthetics, which means that there is no improved aerodynamics over the front wheels, and so overall that remains the same. Now, the Corolla Cross is a little bit confusing in terms of categorization, because it's not quite a B-segment crossover, which therefore would compete with the Honda HR-V and the Proton X50, but it's also not quite a C-segment SUV like the Honda CR-V or the Proton X70. Instead, it sort of sits somewhere in the middle, which means that in terms of its overall size, it's also sitting somewhere in the middle, a bit bigger than B-segment competitors such as the Chery Motor 5 and the Proton X50, but a little bit smaller than the Honda CR-V and the X70. Now, in terms of the overall design down the side, nothing has changed for this new iteration, which means that rolling stock remains exactly the same, replete with diamond finish alloys riding on Toyo Proxys tires, which are again broadly all right. And we also still get the piece of chrome that runs over the top of the windows and then ends back here with a little bit of Corolla Cross badging, which I think is a nice attention to detail. One small change that has been made for this facelift is that now, instead of hybrid, we now get this new HEV badge, which is in line with the very latest hybrid systems and hybrid products from Toyota available globally. I do think this looks a lot better now. It's a lot more distinctive, which means that eventually people will simply recognize seeing that roundel as a sign of it being a hybrid. Now, one of the things about this car that I don't quite like is the fact that for whatever reason, this press car has been fitted with these optional little bits up here. Now, I don't like these because, number one, I think they age the car, and number two, they create a ridiculous whistling noise, which is minor but still present. And because this car is quite quiet, when you're cruising about 80-90 kilometers an hour, that whistle becomes quite distinctive. This I do not like at all. There have also been precious few changes at the rear, partly because this back end was kind of decent to look at anyway, and so Toyota has seen fit to just leave it for the most part, which means that the metalwork is the same, the bumpers are the same, the badging remains the same, except for that new HEV badge that I mentioned earlier. However, the taillights have been revised, believe it or not, because while the overall signature remains the same, now at the back it sort of curves inward, as opposed to how it used to just go straight. Yeah, Toyota's designers aren't really hot on big facelifts, but there we are. Now, the other thing that hasn't changed with the Corolla Cross is actually in terms of the practicality, because behind this powered tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space, certainly larger than what you get from certain B-segment crossovers and certainly larger than what you get from, say, a Subaru XV, but it is a little bit smaller than what you get on a Honda CR-V, although I think it is broadly the same size as what you get on a Proton X70. One thing that is worth pointing out, however, is that because this is a hybrid where the electric batteries sort of live between the rear wheels, that does mean there is no underfloor storage, which is why the mandatory Toyota emergency kit on this car has had to sit up here. And because this car also comes with an optional rear cargo tray, which is made of plastic, this thing has been rolling around the entire time I've been driving it, which is a little bit annoying. Now, there are I hate to bring this up, but there are Velcro points at the back of this thing, which means that it should theoretically stick to the backs of the rear seats. In theory. In practice, not so much. Speaking of which, the rear seats can be folded 60-40 for added practicality, which should mean that your Corolla Cross will be able to accommodate if you need to move house, for example. Small house, but it'll move stuff. Now, the inside of the Corolla Cross also sees very, very minimal changes. So for starters, this infotainment screen is now larger than before, which means that the display itself looks a little bit sharper, and it also comes with wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which displays quite quickly if you ask me. On top of that, it is still decently responsive, again, despite it being completely wireless, and of course, because it is wireless, it does mean that you can also fully utilize the wireless charging pad that lives down there. The other big change comes in terms of the instrument cluster, which is now fully digital, which means that, again, we're getting one of the newest systems from Toyota, something that we've seen before from the Toyota Corolla as well as the Toyota Camry, and this is overall a pretty good system. Even though it is fully digital, they have resisted the urge of making it gimmicky with a lot of its functions and a lot of its features, and instead it just focuses on looking in a manner or presenting the information in a manner that's very easy for drivers to get a hold of and also to get used to. Of course, if you do change the drive modes between normal, power and eco, obviously there are some cool animations to it, which I think is a nice touch, but it never lingers around too long that it takes away from the information that you need, which I think is an important touch. Now, moving further down, the center stack has not been redesigned in the slightest, which means you still get physical controls for your HVAC system, thankfully. And moving further down, you now get an electric parking brake, the first for the Corolla Cross, which used to use a foot parking brake instead. Now, the reason why this is important is twofold. Firstly, it now offers auto hold, which is honestly a feature that all cars should come with in 2025. But more importantly, the inclusion of electric parking brake also means that now this car has full speed adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, which means that this car can now come to a halt when you are stuck in traffic, rather than the old Corolla Cross, which used to only do adaptive cruise control down to about 30 kilometers an hour, and then you'd have to do the work yourself, which I thought was always a little bit pointless, because the whole point of adaptive cruise control is to help in traffic jams more than anything else. Now, beyond that, the ergonomics in this car are pretty good, because this electric driver's seat, for example, allows you to get to a nice, comfortable position. And of course, unlike Chinese vehicles, you do get the option of base angle adjustment, not just overall height, which means that you can get good under-thigh support when you're sat here. And of course, the steering wheel also adjusts a pretty decent degree, which means that, again, finding a comfortable driving position is not a difficult thing at all. It is unfortunate, however, the passenger seat in this car is manual. Regardless of which grade you go for, it is always a manual passenger seat. But there we are. I also appreciate the fact that this center armrest can actually be extended further forward, which means that if you're sat here, you do enjoy pretty comfortable places to rest your arms, or rather your elbows. So over a long distance drive, for example, it is pretty comfortable. Material quality in here is also quite good, because while the top of the dash is hard plastic, the front of the dash is this nice sort of faux leather replete with stitching. The same goes for the tops, the door cards, and down here where you rest your elbow, it is nice and soft. This cowling here is hard plastic, but honestly, who's touching parts like this anyway? More often than not, you're touching bits like this and bits like this. And so the fact that they've paid attention to the details does matter quite a bit. Now, because this is a facelift, some of the materials in here have been changed. So for example, the armrest, or rather parts of the door card, are now done up in this faux brown leather, which I think looks pretty alright, and that same color is also repeated in the center of the seats themselves, very similarly to what we've seen before from the Toyota Camry. Just a little bit of contrasting paneling right in the center, which I think is an interesting touch, not necessary, but interesting. And I think that it certainly feeds into the fact that this car is meant to appeal to a very broad audience, and so they're not trying to rock the boat too much. Overall, I do think that life in here is not that bad. In terms of practicality, you've got a couple of cup holders here, large enough to fit in a water bottle. You've also got decently sized door bins, big enough to fit a 1.5 liter size bottle in the front, as well as a decently sized center console, or rather glove box up here, which unfortunately is not lined in felt, which means that anything you put in there is going to rattle about when you're driving around. But overall, I do think the Corolla Cross is decently well specified, and I don't think there's anything in here that will be considered particularly offensive to a majority of buyers. I think this is pretty much all right. Now, with the front seat set up in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom. And these seats can also be adjusted for the recline angle, which means that if I want to sit further upright, that's also a possibility. Although, obviously, most people prefer to sit reclined. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the hybrid batteries on this car actually live underneath the back seats, which means that the seat base of this car is quite generously proportioned, which means even sat here, I do have a good amount of under-thigh support. And of course, because the front seats are mounted quite high, that also means I have plenty of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, which means that even if there is a taller front passenger, I should still be comfortable back here. Now, in terms of the overall accommodations, life back here is not that bad. Like I said, these seats are quite comfortable and they are decently scalloped, which means I have a good amount of side support. All of the materials that you touch and interact with in here are of a high quality. The tops, the door cards, for example, are nice and soft. This armrest squab is also nice and soft. However, in between is scratchy plastic, but that is exactly the same as it is in the front. Now, what is a bit strange is while I do have cup holders here, I don't seem to have a pocket behind the driver's seat, although there is one behind the passenger seat, which is a little bit odd. And while I have a couple of USB-C ports, which is nice to see, and a couple of crotch coolers down here, which is again always nice, what I do find strange is the fact that even though this is a front wheel driven car, there is also still a hump in the floor, which means that a center passenger here will be fighting for foot space and they may not be quite as comfortable as the two outer rear passengers. Although if you're only carrying two abreast back here, there is a deployable center armrest which now floats instead of flops, which is always nice to see. And of course, there are ISOFIX mounts back here if you want to mount child seats. However, there are only two ISOFIX mounts in this car, those being on the rear seat with none available for the front, which means that in terms of overall versatility of this space, you are somewhat limited. However, if you do have children back here, the shoulder line on this car is not too high and the tint comes as standard, which means that children should be a little bit safer, a little bit cooler back here, and because of that low shoulder line, they should enjoy a pretty good view out. In fact, visibility in this car is generally pretty good because even as an adult sat back here, this seat is mounted higher than the front, which means that I have a good view out. And as for the driver, there is a pretty good view over the shoulder and also out through the quarters, thanks to this car's relatively generous glass house. Now, the thing about the Corolla Cross Hybrid in particular is the fact that this car puts fuel efficiency and overall carbon neutrality or reduced carbon emissions at the forefront, which means that this car needs to be both quiet, comfortable, and fuel efficient. Now, we've had this car for about 4 days now, and so let's see what the results look like. Now, when we talk about hybrid systems, the Japanese have largely been at the cutting edge of these things. They've been a pioneer in hybrid setups. In fact, if I recall correctly, the first Prius was produced somewhere in the mid to late 90s, which means that when we talk about a hybrid Toyota, naturally, there is a very high benchmark or very high expectation set toward these vehicles. Now, as I mentioned earlier, up front there is a 1.8 litre naturally aspirated engine paired to a hybrid setup with a CVT gearbox set in the middle. Now, this is a different setup than what we've seen from, for example, vehicles like the Haval H6 or in fact even the Honda EH-EV hybrid setup, where the electric motor for this car is actually sandwiched between the engine and the gearbox, and so it serves as a starter generator in order to start the vehicle, in order to get it off from a standstill, but it's also able to power the car up to a pretty decent speed, up to about 80-85 kilometers an hour based on my observation. However, with Toyota systems, the primary drive still comes from the engine, which means that even though this car has a relatively large battery, about 1.8 kilowatt hours, similar to what you get from vehicles like the Nissan Kicks or again the Haval H6 HEV, the primary motivation being the engine means that the electric motor in this car is quite small, and so all it does is kind of assist the engine in everything that it needs to do. So for example, when you're setting off from a standstill and you need a little bit more punch, the electric motor and the engine will work together in order to provide motive force. It's only at very slow speeds and upon very light throttle application does the electric motor do the majority, if not all, of the work, which means that in order to drive this car on electric power alone, it does require a certain degree of restraint, as it were. There is an EV mode in here, and if there is sufficient battery, then the car will drive itself on electric power alone, which is especially useful, for example, when you're crawling in or out of home in the middle of the night, if you don't want to wake up the neighbors. But that said, this car isn't exactly very loud, even with the engine on, at least from the outside, no louder than any other vehicle, and so as far as I'm concerned, that's really not that big of a deal. Now, the benefit to this hybrid setup from Toyota is that, according to them, it simplifies ownership. While you have an electric motor and an electric powertrain, it doesn't mean that it actually changes your lifestyle in any way. You still go to a petrol pump to fuel up, and this car takes about 30 to 36 liters for a full tank. And with that, this car will cover about 550 to 580 kilometers on a single tank, which is, again, not that bad compared to the standard model without the electric powertrain. Of course, you get a larger petrol engine, but in order to do a similar amount of distance, it will be consuming more fuel. Now, because of this simplified ownership, this simplified driveline, it does mean that in theory, you shouldn't really have to do anything. You just refuel like you would any other car, and you just put your foot down like you would in any other car. And the hybrid system in the Corolla Cross rewards when you drive this car as gently as possible, the way you would any other car. Because in my testing, with which I've done just under 400 kilometers through a variety of different conditions, including stop-start traffic as well as some high-speed runs along the motorway, this car is still doing a combined average of 5 liters to the 100, which is excellent for a vehicle like this. Bear in mind, the Corolla Cross is not exactly a small car. You can very easily fit a couple of adults behind me, or 3 at a push, as well as space for child seats should you need it, which means that, again, this is a pretty practical machine. And at no point has it felt like this car has run out of puff, unless I'm cruising at a very high speed, but we'll get to that shortly. In terms of urban driving, the Corolla Cross Hybrid is a pretty good companion. It's smooth, all of the controls are very well weighted, and they're very well judged, which means that things like the throttle pedal and even the brake pedal, for example, feel very natural to use. At no point are you left second-guessing the car, or does it feel like the car is second-guessing you. The only time where this car tends to fall apart is actually at motorway speed, simply because of those little plastic things on top of the windows, like I mentioned earlier. Those things are quite irritating because they result in whistling at speeds of about 80 kilometers an hour. And because they are an official accessory, I would expect a little bit better from UMW Toyota in terms of sourcing these parts, because they could have gotten a higher quality item, surely. But again, when you drive at higher speed, it is not the refinement that's the issue, because in terms of road noise and wind noise, aside from those vents, it is generally all right, generally par for the course, no quieter, but more importantly, no louder than the competition, although the X70 to me does feel a little bit quieter when driven at speed. However, the issue with this car comes in terms of the powertrain, because as I mentioned, this engine is naturally aspirated, which means it doesn't exactly have a whole dollop of torque sitting down low in the rev range. On top of that, this car runs an Atkinson cycle, which means that the engine itself doesn't really produce that much power and torque anyway, which means that when you are trying to maintain, say, 120, 130 kilometers an hour on the motorway, you will find that the powertrain does struggle in order to sort of maintain that speed, particularly if you're climbing a hill, for example. At that point, the engine makes itself very, very known to the cabin. For example, if I were to provide a simulation, when you put your foot down, the engine, again, does seem to break into the cabin. The noise really does make itself known under heavy throttle application, which means that it's not quite as serene as you'd expect it to be. Vehicles like the Haval H6 HEV do a much better job thanks to its turbocharged powertrain, which means that when the engine does have to provide motive force, it never feels like it's strained, particularly under the weight of the vehicle. However, bring it back down to reasonable speeds, and again, the NVH goes back to reasonable levels. This car is decently comfortable, decently refined, again, good enough for the majority of consumers and the majority of the tasks that they will level at this car. In terms of the ride, that is where I think Toyota has done a particularly good job. Now, bear in mind the Corolla Cross is available as a GR Sport, which no doubt has sharper handling to boot. However, this base model still doesn't feel all that bad. Yes, it's a little bit on the softer side, and there is a pretty decent amount of body roll if you were to throw it into a corner like you've forgotten that you're driving a crossover. But as far as I'm concerned, it does feel very well judged. When you're driving in urban settings, for example, it smoothens out the worst of the lumps and bumps, the worst imperfections of the road to create a very comfortable, very pleasant driving experience. And of course, when speeds do pick up, you will appreciate the fact that the suspension in this car doesn't isolate you from the road the way certain Chinese market vehicles do, and then leave you as a driver feeling unsure of what the car is dealing with. This car feels very sure-footed and very stable, although that stability does tend to erode at higher speed, although again, I suspect this could be fixed by simply opting for the GR Sport model instead. And then comes the matter of safety. As I mentioned earlier, this car now benefits from an electric parking brake, which I know sounds like a very minor thing, but it makes a very big difference from behind the wheel, because it means that now finally the Toyota Corolla Cross offers full-speed adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, which is a feature that we recommend highly, particularly for people who get stuck in traffic a lot, which is basically the majority of people. Simply because that does allow the car to do the majority of the work. It makes transiting and going back and forth from work, for example, feel like a much less strenuous affair. And of course, this comes in addition to things like blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, lane centering, and lane departure warning, the usual gamut of active safety features that you would expect from a family car in 2025. The Toyota Corolla Cross offers it all. And so as far as I'm concerned, this does feel like a pretty well-specified vehicle, particularly given the fact that the ADAS systems in any Toyota tend to be very, very well calibrated, which means that you are more likely to use them on more occasions rather than for occasional use. So overall, the Toyota Corolla Cross does feel like a very well-specified, very well-rounded package, and it will certainly fit the bill for a lot of families looking for a car that will be efficient, reliable, and safe, because that is exactly what this car is. However, if you are looking for an electrified vehicle like the Corolla Cross, but something that offers a little bit more in terms of overall performance, particularly something that will offer a little bit more punch, especially when you're out on the motorway trying to maintain motorway speeds, then I would recommend looking at the Haval H6 HEV, which in addition to having a very trick hybrid powertrain, also offers a little bit more space because that car is physically larger. However, if you're looking for a sharper drive, then of course there is the Corolla Cross GR Sport, which you can also get in a hybrid powertrain, if I'm not wrong, which should offer the best of both worlds, the efficiency of the hybrid system while offering the excellent drivability that we've seen from other GR Sport branded models, save for the Hilux. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it does mean that this car has some competition, but it should still be able to carve out a nice niche for itself, because the Corolla Cross remains an incredibly polished package, and that polish is not something that is easy to ape or mimic. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2025 Toyota Corolla Cross Hybrid. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can hit the link in the description below to join our new WhatsApp channel so that you remain up to date with the very latest news from the Malaysian automotive industry. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.